Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Sunday webinar. It's March. It's not March 25th, but I think it's March 29th would be my guess. Um, Welcome to the webinar. This afternoon, I wanted to talk about something I think that's pretty important for a lot of people, especially in the beginning. But I think also the middle of the Evoke life cycle can be challenging. And the reason I think this webinar is particularly important is because when I talk about it like this in general, or when I talk about it in advance, for example, you might be reading this or watching this webinar months or years later. I think it's helpful to know that these are patterns that are consistent across time, and that what you're seeing can be kind of normed against what we're talking about during this kind of webinar that describes the way that a child, adolescent, or young adult goes through their process in wilderness therapy. So I'll talk about that and talk through the stages. I think it's a wake up call. I mean, we don't call it just that, but it's absolutely a culture shock when people get here. Even if they choose to come, it's hard to anticipate the experience of being outdoors and primitive living and being in a group that you don't know. And I think a lot of this can relate to this in the way that when we walk into something that we've signed up for, walk into a meeting or a group, we can feel that anxiety, that lack of comfort, lack of being inside of our comfort zone. So initially, it's a shock. I think for parents and children, one of the things that I worry about in the initial phase is that sometimes this step, which might seem dramatic to some people, and I don't see it as so, but which might be dramatic to some people, I think after that initial anger, after that initial anxiety and fear about whatever crisis that they're going through, it can be challenging because once we feel calm and our anxiety is reduced, then we have to deal with the practical fact that our child is out in the wilderness and that we're at home and that we're going to be going through a process that's going to last several weeks. And so I watch for that in clients. I watch for it to dissipate, the anger to dissipate, and can they still keep committed to the process. I know for me, and I've seen this in families over the years, that sometimes it's hard to set a boundary when I'm not angry. And I see that for families. It's much easier. In fact, anger is one of those fuels, if you will, that gets people to be able to set a boundary. But when that initial anger and crisis is gone, it can be the greatest challenge, or the greatest challenge sets in. There's obviously a missing of the child, and I think the same thing is pretty consistent with the children out there. When I say children during this webinar, I'm talking about adolescents and young adult. There can be a missing of things or people back home, and that's a pretty common experience. And I think for parents, it's hard to find people to talk to. That's why at Evoke we have a parent mentor system. That's why we have these webinars, and there's a first week webinar, is because we want you to be in a place where you can feel understood. Like I said at the outset of this broadcast, what we're trying to cover as many cities as we can. I'm looking into Austin. I'll be in Austin at the end of next month, at the end of April. I'll be in New York City on Wednesday and in Philadelphia on Tuesday. And then we have some Southern California and Northern California ones, and then we'll spread it out. But the point being this, we're trying to provide as many settings for people so they can be in a room with people that they don't have to over explain themselves to, that just get them, that know what it's like to wake up on a Tuesday morning at 3 a.m., introduce your child to two strangers and ask them to go to a program, or for your young adult to walk away in a different kind of fashion. So I think it's difficult for people to understand, especially people from the outside, because they don't feel and see the crisis and the tension and the difficulty that you and your child have been living through. So that can be difficult for them. A lot of children will say, or their initial reaction will be, that you lied to me. And I've even been on the phone with children to explain to them what we do at Evoke. And even after that, they say it's still a different experience, even when I try to be as transparent as possible. That's one of the reasons why I encourage parents to take a less is more approach. Um, a lot of times I'll just tell students, you're going to be surprised, you're not going to like it at first, and by the end, you're not going to want to leave. But I don't get into a lot of the details because they can't, there's nothing like being in it to help them understand what's going on. There's a lot of different kinds of responses initially in the program. There's a shutting down, a refusal, don't want to write. They just kind of wait it out. Sometimes they're in despair that comes from this shame And then sometimes it's just, I don't even know how to be in this place. There's a lot of, I can't do it. I'm not able to do it. I give up. I'm sorry. I'll come home. You've made your point. All those kinds of responses can present themselves. And a lot of times, clients and students will go through a series of these. It's not that they'll have one of them, but for one moment or one day or one week, it'll be one version of this, and then it might change. And that's still during the initial shock period. Um, People have asked me what we do if they're coming off of drugs and they need detoxification. We'll do that either at base or in a hospital that we work with at our locations. And if they get sick, we'll be able to provide them medication, rest. If they need to come out of the field, we can do that, and they can rest in a hotel room or something like that. So that's important. Um, One of the things that happens is that your child will begin to miss things, miss people, and they'll talk about it in ways. I think there's this kind of, I call it the withdrawal. We don't see a lot of withdrawal in a lot of clients. We see them in some, opiate addiction and benzodiazepines, and rarely in young adults we might see some other things, but typically we don't see a lot of physiological withdrawals. But what we see is this missing, right? We see this, I want to be home. I want to be with my friends. I want the creature comforts. I want family. They'll even start to miss things that they were refusing at home, things like school. Then they'll often settle into what I'll call this fight mode about resisting the process. They might threaten, negotiate. It looks a lot like Kubler-Ross's stages of grief, right? The denial and the bargaining and the anger, and they go through those kinds of stages. So they might threaten to not love you, threaten to not forgive you, try to negotiate a deal to come home. Some of you have heard some versions of this before, so you're ready for it. It's not hard to resist. Sometimes the sad presentation is one of the hardest to resist. I'm so sorry. I realize what I've done wrong. They become extraordinarily self-critical sometimes, talking about my parents were perfect. They didn't do anything wrong. I did everything wrong. And of course, that's unrealistic and untrue for everybody. So we'll talk about learning to take accountability in a more responsible, insightful way. I think there's an I promise that's pretty common. I always found humor when the client or student would say to me, this was a great intervention. My parents chose very, very wisely. I get the point. I promise I'll never do it again. Any time beyond today is a waste of time. So great up to this point, but any time past it is going to be a waste of time. So there's this promise to try to get home. And then, of course, there's all the above, and they mix and they cycle through it. Um, Sometimes it's calculated, conscious. Sometimes it's just their coping skills. And I think the most important thing to say, and parents will ask us a lot of the time, how sincere is it? How realistic is it? How internalized is it? And my response often is, it doesn't make much of a difference in terms of how we treat it. We're patient. We hold a boundary. We're empathic. We listen. We're compassionate. But in the end, we hold a boundary. And we take a we'll see kind of attitude. And we invite parents to take that same kind of we'll see type of attitude. Sometimes there's actually a webinar on running if you need that. On occasion with adolescents, they'll try running or escaping. They'll go on a hunger strike. They'll try to emotionally punish parents through letters or by their lack of participation or their attitude. They'll try to punish parents through the process. And then nothing will work for them, right? Like you can't help me. I can't learn anything from this program. And of course, my response always is, that tells me a lot more about you than it does about this program. The average person could get a great deal out of this. And the higher functioning, the more insightful you are, the more you will get out of the program. They begin to move away from home, and they begin to identify with students and staff here as they make it to the tail end of that fighting it phase. And that's really when we get that initial buy-in, that initial kind of emotional leverage where we're all in it together, supporting each other, and they start to settle in. At first, of course, I wouldn't expect any different. Most of them will try practicing the skills just to get through it, doing the assignments. I'm going to do what I need to do to get out of here. Now, from the initial phase, what I say and encourage the parents to say is, don't look toward the finish line. We don't know how long this is going to take. And you really can't. A lot of parents want to say something like, they want to say it's okay for you to work, and that is going to determine your length of stay, right? It's going to determine your length of stay. But the fact of the matter is, parents are going to decide the length of stay. In the case of adolescents, and with young adults, there's some more finesse with it. But it's okay to say, I'm going to decide. And I'm not going to pay attention to every tiny detail of your progress or regression. I'm going to take a step back. I'm going to take a 10,000 foot perspective view of things. I'm going to think with my adult brain, and I'm going to make a decision. And that's opposite of what most parents want to do. Most of them want to dangle the carrot out there. But I always say, I don't know how long it's going to take. There's a lot of variables, and I'm not going to give you a simple carrot to work toward. But they start to practice the skills. They start to pretend to be accountable, right? And what I mean by that is they practice the tools that we teach them around accountability. But accountability, of course, comes much later when they've let go, when they're trusting the process, when they're not trying to get a lot of say in the process, and they're in this kind of accepting place, accepting that they need help, accepting that they don't have all the answers. A lot of them will try to behave themselves in the beginning, and those are the students that typically get frustrated with the process, that will somewhere in the middle say, look, I'm doing everything I can, I'm doing my assignments, and I'm not getting the kind of reinforcement, the kind of returns from you, Brad, from you, the therapist, from you, mom and dad, that I want in this process. And again, we start to identify at that phase this concept, this idea that they're working for external rewards instead of working to better their lives, because that's really what this program is about. They complete assignments, they enjoy social aspects of the group and program, become competent at primitive living skills, camping, and all that's involved with that. They can give others feedback with insight pretty early on in the process. This is the joke that I constantly tell parents. They already have your lectures memorized because early on in the process, they're giving those lectures to their peers. They stop overtly manipulating. They start to hear examples of manipulation. They might have a student in the group that's reading a letter that he or she wrote home, and they're talking about ways to manipulate. Some of those skills and insights come when they share the letter with us, the therapist, in session, and we're giving them feedback about the obvious manipulation. So they start to let go, get rid of, surrender the old ways of manipulating overtly, and they have a respect for the staff and the therapist early on. Then there's this point, on average, maybe 4.5 weeks is when they start to turn. It can be longer. My own son, I would say, took about 8 weeks to make this or begin this turn. But I would say on average, somewhere 4 or 5 weeks, they'll begin to turn. And it's not a sudden, dramatic aha moment. It's this kind of learning that to me demonstrates more internalization when it comes in small increments, when they start to get it sporadically. And that sporadic insight starts to increase and starts to draw this thread through their treatment where they're starting to respond to feedback, to group situations, to teaching, to experiences, to letters in a more thoughtful, mature, and accountable way. Their accountability increases, their insight increases, responsibility, ownership, duty, respect. They become more honest. They start to understand that because it's not a short-term process, no matter how long they're at Evoke or where they go after, it's not a short-term process. So they start to understand that honesty is more important than pleasing or behaving well. And then they start to lead others with more patience, more compassion, but definitely also with more assertiveness. At this point, they begin to identify with authority figures more, with the staff, than they do with their peers, especially the younger peers, by length of stay, that are in the program. They start to gain an appreciation for wilderness and the lessons that they're learning. They start to become happy with learning, seek after learning, any kind of learning. They're appreciating the interventions and also can become a part of using or creating interventions with other students. They start to trust us and you a little more in the process because they've let go. This is an important principle. Maybe the single most important principle in this webinar today. A lot of parents, a lot of us, want to get our children to understand or internalize a certain principle, right? An idea, a principle, an ethic, a value, whatever you want to say. The thing is that we want them to internalize. The best way that we can get them to do that is not by teaching and lecturing and coercing and nagging and begging and pleading and encouraging. The best way to do that is to teach it shortly, set up boundaries, and let go. And when we do that, the child begins to realize, because he's not or she's not in this dance with parents and authority figures that's manipulative or coercive, or that's a power struggle, they realize, if I can't control my circumstances, then the only thing left is for me to control myself. In fact, that quote's on the front of my book by Viktor Frankl. If I can't control my circumstances, the only thing left is to focus on controlling myself. They start to become happier. The pictures coming home, the letters coming home, start to sound happier. We always say that the surest way to make an Evoke therapy student frown is to show up with a camera, because that's the early part of the program where they're trying to make you pay for their unhappiness, make you feel responsible for their unhappiness, tempt you and trigger you into rescuing them from their unhappiness or feeling guilty, so that somehow you'll ease up on the boundary or the intervention. But they start to be happier. They start to feel safe. They start to feel safe emotionally in the group. And they start to get this sense of liberation, because they've learned to shift their locus of control from the external, that is, what happens to me, to the internal, which is, it's what I do with it. And then they realize they've tapped into, like all of us long for, it's a spirituality, it's an existential freedom. They start to tap into the most important sense of feeling free, which is, I am going to focus on me. My project is me. I'm going to focus on changing. And then they start looking in their pictures and sounding different on the phone calls, if you have them by that chance, which in most cases that's about the time you'll be having a phone call. Now, let's talk about regression, because it not only is it normal for every human being, and for our clients and students it might be more normal, if you will, but we want it to happen. We want them to experience it while they're at Evoke. And I've learned, for doing this for 20 years, if everything goes well here, and they end on this peak, this high, then when they do regress, because everybody will experience stages of that, then everybody thinks it's because of the new setting. And they'll talk about wanting to come back to Evoke and wanting to go back to the experience. But we want them to experience it while they're here, so that we can talk about it, deal with it, internalize it, digest it, make sense out of it. And every act or phase of regression is not the same. And so we don't treat it the same. We treat it based on how able, how willing, how capable they are of making meaning out of that mistake, out of that regression, out of that old brain, that old behavior. They start to talk toward the end about being bored. That's because they've gotten through the shock, which was in itself, in a way, exciting. Then they start to transition to this learning and growth period, which is, of course, exciting and exhilarating. And now it's a Tuesday. And Tuesdays aren't very exciting. And so they say, I know how to do this, and I'm ready to move on, and this is boring for me. And our response is, I think you're at the point where this is starting to feel like life. Because, going to work on Monday is Monday. No matter how much you love your job, there are parts of it, I'm sure for all of us, that are challenging because they're bored, because they're such a routine. So we start to help them move through boredom, which is a lot of what the adolescent brain, that brain from the age of 13 to about the age of 25, struggles with, right? It's not easily stimulated. It takes a lot more stimulus for the adolescent brain to get a sense of exhilaration or excitement or happiness than it does the adult brain. We know that. That's why they're more prone to risk-taking behaviors, unstable relationships, addictions. So they get bored easily. So we help them through that process. They start to relax, let down their guard, stop trying to impress. And we start to see pieces that are going to be themes for their therapy for the coming months, if not years. A lot of times, this is a point where we can highlight, what were you working for? Were you working for the short-term gain? And I mentioned that already in a couple of stages. but that's an important part of it. I think the greatest challenge and probably the most consistent skill that we ask parents to use at this phase or at these stages are when we talk about getting out of all or nothing, good or bad, right and wrong, black and white thinking. In fact, families that were interviewed in the study that I've referred to before that identified themselves as successful, the number one thing was this ability to avoid black and white, all or nothing thinking. And to say, well, we're not back at square one. We're not back at zero. Yes, this looks like and sounds like some of the things that remind me of zero, but you can't go back. We're different. You're different. It's different. So that's an important part of it. They start to consider themselves, become more self-aware. I think for parents, it's a period where the feelings, I think for everybody, the feelings that are deeper beneath the surface are things that they start to have to deal with because it's not about doing at this place, it's about being. And then we move toward transition, and that can happen with a variety of trajectories. I talk about this idea that they move from denial to basically resignation to acceptance to buy-in to self-motivation. That's kind of a phase that we'll look at the student who goes through this process. But, at this point, we're talking about getting them ready for the next step. And one of the things that makes us successful all the time is that because we're not just a therapeutic program, we are that, but we're also an assessment program. And we're also a preparation for the next step program. And because we are those two things, then how quickly, slowly, dramatically, subtly they progress, what ways they progress, what has worked for them in their progress, really sets us up to teach the parent and the child and say, here's what I think is going to be helpful for you going forward in the next step. So that's why they can be at various stages, because we're not going to cure anybody of all things. So we get them ready for the next step. The visits and the phone calls from parents, I've told this story before where a consultant, this is many years ago, we were the first wilderness therapy to have satellite and cell phone calls out in the field. We were the first one to ever have parent visits during the process. That was not done before we opened up. And part of the process that happens, and this consultant shared with me, is you're taking away the climax. If you have parents come out at week 5 or 6 and then you have them come out at week 9 for a graduation or a transition program, you're really taking part of the climax away. And I thought about that because actually she was right. That was the thing that made it most difficult for me to respond to. But then what I realized is that's good, because Tuesdays and Wednesdays aren't that exciting at home. So let's get back to, let's not just take advantage of this climax that happens when there's this reuniting moment or day, and we've seen some progress, but let's really help families gear up for the long haul, for the rest of their life. And so you'll start to see that romance of, I miss you back, I miss you back. You'll start to see some of the romance of that fade, and it sounds and looks a lot more like real life. A lot of times they get to this places they're getting closer and getting eager to leave, is they'll want to be anywhere but here. And that goes back to that idea of withdrawal. Like, I just don't want to be here because here doesn't feel exciting. So they have this fantasy that I want to be in the next set. Let me get back to normal life. Now, having said that, I can't tell you, because the number's too high and it's too common for clients and students when they get to where they're going to realize, oh, that wasn't bad. In fact, I want to go back to the wilderness. That's very, very, very common. And even when I tell them that, and they can't believe that could be true, many of them call back and say, yeah, I miss it. Family work becomes the focus. Parent work becomes the focus. Early on, it's a lot about accountability and boundaries and really just basic healthy coping. And then we become more and more systemic in the process, although we're working with systemic issues from the beginning. But for the whole family, it becomes systemic work, relationships, communication, boundaries, dynamics, complementary roles, those types of things. We start talking about relapse prevention and awareness, focusing on not thinking in black and white or all or nothing. So we're not going like this in our progress, right? But we're kind of just going like this in our progress. And then, of course, they get more and more excited to leave and imagine that that next step holds all of the joys and all of the treasures and all of the answers. I say to students, when it's over, they say, I want to get out of here, I'm done. And I say, when you're done, you know how you'll know when you're done? You'll see a truck pull up and we'll tell you it's time to go. And I don't mean to be sarcastic or terse about it, but the idea is you're here, you're here. This is life. And I think maybe everybody struggles with thinking that the happiness is just around that bend up ahead, just around that turn. When I graduate from high school, when I graduate from college, when I get married, when I have kids, when I'm doing better financially, when I get the promotion, when I retire, right? We constantly are chasing. When my son is not in treatment anymore, when my daughter is out of her depression, we keep thinking that happiness is over there ahead of us instead of enjoying and embracing the journey, even when it's difficult, even when it's painful, because all of that stuff mixed together is life. Have you ever seen the movie, I think it's called Flick? It's with Adam Sandler and Christopher Walken. Just kind of a funny movie years ago where he had a remote control, a TiVo remote control, where he could fast forward the hard parts of life. And then he ends up at the end realizing that he missed everything that made everything wonderful to go through the struggle. So it's over when it's over. I already talked about avoiding either or thinking. This could be said from the beginning, which is, as parents, understand the highs aren't that high and the lows aren't that low, right? Take a step back. That's part of detachment. It's part of doing your own work. And it's getting off the roller coaster that your child is riding or leading in the process. And then in the end, you're turning their success over to them. As you get ready to transition and you're a part of, in most cases, if you're talking about adolescents, you are the lead of making the transition decisions, that ultimately you turn it over to them. You do the best you can from your love, from your heart, from your studying, and then you turn over success to them. As you come out, get ready to come out, we teach the same thing to your children. Understand that the goal is to work. I think people come out oftentimes with the sense of celebration in their minds, and that can be a part of it. But most importantly, what's the work? What's the work that you still all need to do? And then there's an adjustment. There's an adjustment to the complicated nature of life. Wilderness life is simple and safe. And there are very few balls to juggle. I've used this analogy for years now, where it's like we teach them to juggle 3 balls really, really well. Then they get ready and they go on to the next place and they get handed 2 more balls. That's 5 balls now. And for any of you that know how to juggle, you know that there's a huge qualitative leap between 3 and 5. And most of us would drop them all. That doesn't mean you've forgotten how to juggle. That just means that there's more to juggle. We still practice letting go of the outcomes. We still try to take with us that sense of internal and external locus of control, that shift that we talked about, so that we can carry it forward. And understanding that in this entire process, things go out of order. And not everything goes well. I don't know why this slide is doing this, but it says live questions. I'll take them in just a moment. But the important process is you're already there. Meaning part of the important, learning lesson at Evoke is to embrace the fact that it's not the next thing, the more money. It's not when your child gets out of therapy. It's not when your child is in mainstream society. It's not for them when they get to school or when they're independent of you that's going to make them happy. The things, the mechanisms that make us happy are within us. And when we're not unhappy, the solution is to embrace what we're doing, what we're living, what's going on for us right now, and begin to see all of the sweetness. That it's about mindfulness. It's about being present. It's about learning to be instead of do. And it's about letting go of the outcome. So I'm happy to take any questions if any came in during the webinar, Stephanie. About 80%. What percentage of young people leaving your wellness programs are end up going to a residential program of some type? About 80%. I'll say this because I get asked, this might be the most common question I get asked. Um, the reason that is because of our experience. It is not our theoretical orientation. Okay? What I mean by that is I'm not trained, there's no education in school or in psychological theory that says that this ought to be true, what I just shared with you. But my experience has shown me over the years that for most of our clients and students that going on to a therapeutic school or program or transitional living place is a better treatment plan for them. And that's because of the tens of thousands of students that we have seen over the years. So that's what I mean by that it comes from experience. Some people say, well, you have a bias. And I say, yeah, I have a bias. I do. After seeing thousands and thousands of cases, I do have a bias that comes from that experience. But again, you're going to take every client and child individually. What percentage of teens in the adolescent program enter the program willingly? If you mean not by transport, it's difficult. Uh, you know, probably about 2 out of every adolescents are transported. That's going to be in our upcoming study and the differences between how they react. But I will tell you this, and I've talked to the people that do our research. My experience is the ones that come willingly usually take a little bit longer to get into it. Interestingly, the ones whose parents just set a boundary and use transports or escorts, which is a very respectful and compassionate approach, very clear approach where the intervention starts at home with the parents, they tend to get into it better. It usually takes the ones that come willingly a week or two extra to buy in because they'll say things like, "Well, this isn't what I thought, and I should be able to talk to my parents now, and I should be able to come home. And if my parents knew what this was, they wouldn't have me here. And I chose to come here, and now I can choose out." So, it's my experience is just bottom line is people that are transported do better early, and that's not always the case, of course, but that's a trend that I always saw. Do you think that same process holds true once they go to RTC? It seems like my son is repeating the stages in the RTC. It's like we are starting over again. After 3 months there, our therapist just told us that more baggage has arrived at his school. Yeah, I think he'll do that when he comes home too. I think it's like every time there's more freedom, temptation, distractions, complexities, we go through some of these phases. And so it's like testing it all over again, testing it in themselves, testing you, testing the system, testing the new people. And each phase, it's more complex, it's a higher level, but I think the phases repeat themselves over and over again. Absolutely, good question. And the reason that we do it in stages like this is because we see this. Because it's too big of a drop off. Wilderness therapy is so therapeutic, you guys. It's so contained. It's so safe. It's so sterile, and I don't mean that physically. I mean that structurally. It's so sterile from the outside world. So supervised. And so these other settings can be great steps along the process. It doesn't have to be, but that's what we tend to see. How does this process differ with adults that don't live at home? Um, the finesse of adults is that you're getting more, you're trying to, needing to get more buy-in. The thing that is similar is the number one variable. Again, that's just saying the number one variable. Doesn't mean that it's true every time. The number one variable that contributes to adults successfully going through this process is a parent putting their foot down and saying, no, I won't support you and you can't live at home. I love you, but I won't support you in the old ways. And so the therapist will work with the young adult. They're looking for that buy-in. They're looking for that investment. They're looking for that ownership. And as they see that, then they're using the peer group and the staff and themselves to encourage the young adult to choose it. And when that is backed by a parent saying the same way they can with an adolescent legally, you have no other option that I will support, then young adults will move towards that same kind of situation, that same kind of choice, that same kind of choice that would be made for an adolescent. So, and then they have some say in the setting more often. Usually parents will narrow it down or will work with a consultant or a referent to find out what is the best setting. And then young adults will shape that a little bit more, but all of that will still be made in almost all cases with the parents' ultimate seal of approval. So that's what happens a little bit more common. Adolescents can do some of that discussion and dialoguing around what they like, what they want, but that's more dependent upon how bought in they are and how much the parent takes the suggestion and request of the adolescent depends on how much the adolescent is bought in. And the ultimate buy-in is when anybody says, all of my choices got me here. I don't know what's right for me. I thought I knew, so I'm going to trust you, my therapist. I'm going to trust you, mom and dad. And yeah, I'm going to talk about it with you, but I'm going to trust it. And ultimately, the thing that's going to make me make it or not, happy or not, is me. When we start to hear that kind of thing from an adolescent, then of course we're more likely to listen to their choices and requests and desires. I want to send my child a care package for Easter. May I do so? It is a holiday. I would ask your therapist. It's different for each therapist. I typically didn't. I think a card would be fine. And they'll do something. They do something on all of the holidays. They did something on St. Patrick's Day. They'll do something on Easter. They do something on Passover. So um, I would ask your therapist. I can't answer that because it would be different for every group, for every student, for every client, and for every therapist. So my answer would be send a card, a meaningful card, maybe pictures, but candy, food, kind of the things, if you will. Those would be the things I might avoid. If there's a particular religious sentiment you want to express, a letter or talk to your therapist about this. But sometimes students would get the Bible on Easter or something like that, or the Torah or something, some readings on holidays. So are kids that come to you after struggling in a therapeutic residential setting able to successfully reset, reset back into that original program? Great question. I would say, I'm just going off the top of my head, 75 yes, 25 no. 75% yes. I'd say three-quarters of the time yes. And what you have to do when you're the therapist and the parents, you have to take a step back and not get invested in it one way or the other. Because if you do, you're going to invite a power struggle. And whatever they were struggling with at their last setting, oftentimes for them, is being triggered by something about the setting that they didn't like. So you give them some time to sort it out. You do the work that we do at Evoke. And then you start talking with the program, the people there, and the parents, talking about what they need to do to get back. But many of them will say, I don't want to go back. So that carrot that you're offering me, it's irrelevant because I don't want to go back. So then you take a step back and you talk about it with them. So I'd say about 75 yes, 25 no. I'd say about 50-50 they come with us saying that they do or don't want to go back to it. And so we improve that number by about a quarter. And again, these are all just off the top of my head, just my gut, my experience, my exposure. So what happens if a teen turns 18 while he or she is in the program? We transition them over to one of the adult groups. And we have about a 90% success rate of them buying in and signing themselves in the adult group. And at both of our locations, we have adult groups. So we have a whole process. We oftentimes do it by ceremony, by walkabout. We involve both therapists, the old one and the new one. We have all kinds of rituals around it. We have asked them to sign in their paperwork because they have to sign their paperwork. And to date, we have about 90% success rate. 9 out of every 10 students. At one point, we were 100% for the first couple of years, but we've had more numbers since then. So about 9 out of 10 students will do it. And your therapist will prepare and guide you for that. But again, you're trying to increase and facilitate buy-in before that process. before the 18th, the magical 18th birthday when everything is going to change. At least they think so. How do you treat the medical problem of depression differently than choice and behavioral problems like substance abuse and other behaviors? Well, the first point is a lot of people wouldn't necessarily say that behavioral problems and substance abuse and other behaviors are choice, not consciously, right? There are brain structures that lead to depression, that lead to addiction, that even lead to other behavioral problems. So the distinction isn't as clear as you might think. But the answer is, with depression, we'll see if they need medication. We use cognitive behavioral therapies. We're informed by dialectical behavioral therapies. We look into history, so we use dynamic therapies. We use readings, coaching tools, communication tools. But again, it's everybody. And then some of those same theories are applied to, for example, dialectical behavioral therapy is a wonderful approach for mood disorders, severe mood disorders, and also for substance abuse disorders. So you use everything and you find out what works. You use group therapy, you use teaching, coaching, you use the cognitive behavioral model where you're teaching people the relationship between their perceptions and thoughts and their feelings. You're teaching people of their triggers. You're teaching people of their diagnoses. You're teaching of the origin of it so they know how to compensate for it. So you'd be surprised to know that while I can speak to depression and substance abuse, and there are webinars on both of those, that in a group, it all feels very similar, right? It all feels very similar. And many people have comorbid, meaning concurrently they're experiencing two diagnoses at the same time or parts of them. So a lot of the same kinds of things. Of course, you're going to use medication for depression as you wouldn't use it for substance abuse typically. Not often for behavioral problems. Although behavioral problems, agitation and oppositionality and anger is a very common presentation of depression in the adolescent brain. My son's best friend wants to send him a letter. This friend is the only positive peer in his life. Have you had this happen before? All the time. But still, we start off with parents, then we start extending it out to siblings, other family members, and close friends that are positive of the family and of the individual. So my answer is, you got to talk to your therapist, because I don't know what stage they're at in the process. I even got to the stage with many of my students where I was having the negative peers write them because I wanted to see how they would respond to that. But that's a more advanced level. But we start off very, very narrow, and then we expand the circle as we go. So it just depends upon where. I mean, he can write it and you can have it in your hand, talk to your therapist about it, but your therapist at Evoke is going to guide you when they think that step is a good step, is the next step for your child. But that's very common. I'm not being selfish. I know this is not about me, but I'm very worried that she thinks I've abandoned her. That's the biggest struggle so far. Let me think about that. Well, she'll know you haven't then over the long run. She might think it because on the surface it might look like it is to her. But if you're saying is true, and by the way, I don't use the word selfish, so I'm not sure how to talk about it in that way. But if you don't abandon her, she'll know it. That's the answer. If you want to convince her that you haven't, it's going to take longer. If you need her to know right away that you haven't, need to try to talk her into it, it's going to take longer. So my answer is, abandonment would be at any point when we stop paying attention to the child and their needs and giving it to them. And if this is what your child needs, which I assume that it is, then you're not abandoning her. Now, she might not like the proximity, the distance, the boundary, the limit, but that's going to be a common experience for most of our clients and students. That distance is going to be painful. It's going to feel like emotional distance, and it's not. And if at this point in her life she hasn't figured out that you're not going to abandon her, there's an issue that she needs to work through. Maybe she has attachment disorder. I don't know if she's adopted or not, but she will know that you haven't abandoned her by the way that you interact with her through this process and with your Evoke therapist. That's the answer to the question. And if it's not about you, if it's not about you needing to be the parent who doesn't abandon their children, then you're in a good place. If it's about being a bad parent, then that's about you. Then, as for all of you, then we're putting our esteem, our parental esteem, in the hands of our children to take care of us. And we need to learn to take care of ourselves at this point in life. So, but the struggle makes sense. It's hard. I've done it. I know what it feels like. How many adolescents returned to the wilderness after leaving? Oh, so I had 1,000 on my caseload, 1,000 adolescents on my own caseload, and 15, maybe 10 of mine. Not very common at all. Some therapists like it more. I didn't like it a lot, although every time I had it, it was wonderful. Um, Sometimes it's a comfort thing. Sometimes they want it, but sometimes it's necessary to revisit. But it's a so what is that? That's like 1%. No, that's like 0.1%, isn't it? 1% would be 1 out of 100. 10 out of 1,000. Yeah, it's 1% for me. What has been your experience working with students who have just graduated from high school, who will do the wellness program over the summer, but have plans to transition to college in the fall? There's got to be a need. Now, I'm glad that this is a well attended. Maybe we should do this time of the week more often. But we have a program called Pursuits that you can inquire about. In fact, I'm going to go out of this for just a second, Stephanie. I don't know if we have a slide on it or not. Maybe we do. We don't have a pursuit slide, do we? Stephanie, will you put the email for I think it might be Stephanie at evoketherapy.com, actually. Um, but we have a program called Pursuits for young adults. And if the child is 18, they can go to that. So they do leadership, they do some emotional group, but they do a lot of adventure. If they don't have a high clinical need, that would be a great one for them. If they have a high clinical need, then the equation doesn't change one way or the other much anyway. So because when they come, it means that it's a priority, right? That it's first on their priority list and that school will take care of itself. Like I've shared many times, I started college at the age of 21 because of setbacks and because of choices that I made. And then I got straight A's and graduated early through all of my degrees. So you can make that up if you get your head straight, if you get yourself figured out. And this 1 or 2 or 3 year timing thing that we're all married to that we think has to happen because it's the American way, it's just an illusion anyway. So, my answer would be if they have a high clinical need, it works much like the rest of the program. And that back end choice or that back end timing or that back end plan needs to be postponed or needs to be a little bit softer and malleable. If they don't have a clinical need, the Pursuits program would be a great option for them. We do that in the summertime, 28 days. Field staff run it, but they're also wonderful adventure guides, rafting, mountain climbing, canyoneering, other adventure activities. World class. Southern Utah has world class locales and guides. For the person who wrote about abandonment, the staff and other kids reinforced the fact that you did what you did because you love her as much as you did. It was reinforced often in my son's group. Excellent point. Thank you. It is just a natural kind of reaction that sometimes has some authentic kind of experience and fear, but oftentimes it's manipulation. Either way, this parent is absolutely right. The rest of the peers and the staff remind them reasonably, logically, all the time that they did this because they love you. Will my daughter ever want to go camping again? 25% of our staff are former students, on average over the years. That gives you an idea. Most students end up loving it more and appreciating it more. So actually, my experience is that attendance at a wilderness therapy program actually increases their respect, understanding, relationship with nature. And remember, the threats that they make, the things that they say in their adolescent brain, no matter what age we're talking about now, in their adolescent brain are reactions and attempts consciously or unconsciously to manipulate and punish you. So, all right. stay on for a second because I have a few announcements. So I want to get to this because obviously it's past the 25th. So Los Angeles on the 30th. What is that? That's tomorrow night. 49jennifer at live.com. If you're going to attend, please let her know. I'll be in Philadelphia on the 31st at the Marriott at the airport, 7 to 9. I will have copies of my books. I finally got copies of my book this week um, on Thursday, so I'll have a copy of my books that I can sell on the 31st. You can also go to Amazon and order The Journey of the Heroic Parent. That's my book. You can order it. It basically is an overview of all of my philosophies of parenting, of course, written down and taken from many of my favorite webinars. So, Journey of the Heroic Parent, The Journey of the Heroic Parent on Amazon, it's 25% off for pre-sale. If you're in Philadelphia or New York, I'm going to bring they gave me some early copies, so I'm going to bring those. I think I have about 45. So when they're gone, they're gone. You can RSVP to Stephanie at evoketherapy.com. I'll be at the Marriott, the Courtyard Marriott in New York City, which is 1717 Broadway, 54th and Broadway, and then at the Airport Marriott in Philadelphia. Here are the meetings we want. It's part of our program. We ask parents to go to 6 of these meetings. And then please follow us on social media because we're making announcements about parent groups, parent meetings, other activities, blog entries, things like that. I'll be announcing my speaking engagements, and when I have appearances that are more national related to my book, I'll be announcing them on our social media there. At Evoke Therapy for Twitter, Evoke Therapy Programs, the new name for Second Nature and Cascades is our Facebook name, and then there's our blog there. If you're going to buy a book, including my book, you can go to this page, the Amazon Second Nature alumni page, and it's the same price as on Amazon. Only 10% goes to 10% of that goes to the charity to help families who can't afford treatment. So I'd love it. My publisher asked me to publicize my book because it's the last couple of weeks of pre-order. So I'd love to have some pre-sales. Upcoming webinar, I haven't decided yet. I think it's the 6th of April, although I didn't have that down here, Stephanie, but you can confirm that, and we'll send out an announcement soon because I'm going to be on the East Coast all week next week. All right, folks, thank you for everything. Thanks for joining me on a Sunday. I think I'm going to do more weekend and Sunday webinars in the future because we had really good attendance. It might be a good time for families. Have a great week. I'll see some of you in Philadelphia and in New York this week with my book. Take care and talk to you next time. Bye-bye.